At the heart of Adolf Hitler's thought was a fixed idea. The world was a permanent battlefield where peoples, like individuals, were doomed to fight for their survival. For Hitler, history was a biological struggle between races, morality, an invention of the weak, and peace, an illusion that only served to lull the peoples destined to dominate. Born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he had observed from a young age what he considered a failure of German national unity. He saw in the ethnic and cultural diversity of the empire a sign of decadence. His experience in Vienna between 1908 and 1913 was decisive. The imperial city, with its mix of peoples, religions, and dialects, offered him a human laboratory where his hatred crystallized. There he read nationalist pamphlets, listened to anti-Semitic speeches, and absorbed the idea that Judaism was not a religion, but an international conspiracy against the purity of peoples. This belief would become the central axis of his thought. In Mein Kampf, published between 1925 and 1926, Hitler developed his worldview with a prophetic tone. He maintained that Germany's destiny was predetermined by blood, and that its historical duty was to expand eastward to secure the living space, the Lebensraum, that his people needed to prosper. The Slavic peoples, in his conception, were inferior races destined to serve or disappear. Marxism, he said, was a Jewish invention to destroy nations from within, and democracy, a mask of weakness. In his mind, only a racially pure dictatorship could restore German greatness. World War I reinforced all these ideas. The defeat of 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles became the symbol of national humiliation. Hitler did not see that outcome as a military consequence, but as an internal betrayal, a plot orchestrated by socialists, Jews, and liberals. This stab in the back, as he called it, was the myth he needed to justify his future rise. His thought transformed into a religion of national redemption. Germany had to be purified through war, sacrifice, and absolute obedience to a leader destined by history. In Hitler's worldview, nature had no compassion. Only the strongest species survived, and the weak deserved to disappear. This distorted Darwinist idea was projected onto human and political relations. Hitler saw the German people as a collective organism. Each individual had to serve the racial body, and those who did not were parasites. In his speeches, he repeated that modern man had forgotten the harshness of life, and that his mission was to restore the instinct to fight. "The world will not change through speeches, but through iron and blood," he said, convinced that history rewarded peoples willing to kill for their destiny. His vision of art, education, and culture derived from the same principle. Everything had to serve the racial state. Art had to exalt strength, discipline, and purity. Education had to shape bodies and minds. Science had to be subordinated to the biological purpose of the Reich. For Hitler, reason was useful only when it served the will of the people. He despised free thought and intellectual debate, which he considered decadent. Instead, he promoted an aesthetic of greatness and purity, a pagan spirituality centered on blood and soil. Christianity, although used in his public rhetoric, was suspicious to him. He saw it as a religion of compassion, hostile to struggle. However, he understood its symbolic power and used it to legitimize his cause. In his rhetoric, providence replaced God, an abstract force guiding strong peoples to victory. "I fulfill the Creator's will by fighting the Jews," he even claimed. In his mind, extermination was not a crime but divine obedience. Hitler built his ideology as a closed system. Any evidence that contradicted it was reinterpreted as proof of his enemy's conspiracy. His political environment, made up of figures such as Goebbels, Himmler, and Rosenberg, reinforced that bubble of absolute thought. Nazi propaganda became the perfect tool to transform his Weltanschauung into national common sense. The figure of the Führer was elevated to that of an infallible prophet, and millions of Germans began to see the world through his eyes, as a struggle between purity and corruption, between destiny and betrayal. Rearmament and military preparation in secret. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, the Treaty of Versailles still weighed on Germany like a chain. It limited its army to 100,000 men, prohibited military aviation, and restricted naval construction. For him, those conditions were a humiliation imposed by enemies who feared the return of German power. In his first speeches to the leaders of the Reichswehr, The new chancellor was clear. The treaty had to be abolished, not through negotiation, but through accomplished facts. Law is not asked for, it is imposed, he said, and thus the rearmament began in secret. Hitler understood that his main weapon was not steel, but time. During the first years of the Third Reich, his strategy was to gain every possible minute while deceiving the Western powers with gestures of apparent moderation. He appointed Hermann Göring in charge of the newly created Air Ministry, disguised as a civil institution. At the same time, German laboratories began developing engines, airplanes, and bombs under the pretext of scientific research. The Krupp, Daimler, and Messerschmitt factories worked at full capacity on covert contracts with the state. In 1934, Hitler secured absolute control over the armed forces. After the purge of the Night of the Long Knives, in which he eliminated Ernst Röhm and the SA leadership, he gained the support of the regular army, which saw him as a defender of order against revolution. With the death of President Hindenburg in 1934, he proclaimed himself Führer und Reichskanzler, merging political and military leadership. From that moment, all oaths of loyalty had to be made directly to him, not to the German state. Propaganda presented rearmament as a spiritual rebirth. In the Nuremberg parades, Hitler showed the nation his new faith in steel and discipline. Meanwhile, the world watched with a mixture of indifference and hope. Many European leaders, especially in Great Britain, saw the new regime as a bulwark against Soviet communism. Hitler knew how to exploit that perception. Every time he expanded the army or violated a clause of the treaty, he promised it was the last step, that his only desire was to restore German dignity. In March 1935, he delivered the definitive blow. He publicly announced the reinstatement of compulsory military service and the creation of the Luftwaffe, an air force that already existed in secret. It was an act of open defiance of the international order, but the response was weak. France protested, Great Britain expressed concern, and the League of Nations did nothing. Hitler interpreted that silence as a sign. The democracies were not willing to fight for the peace they claimed to defend. That same year, he launched the 4-year plan, entrusting its execution to Göring. The goal was to make Germany a self-sufficient power capable of sustaining a long war. Investments were made in steel, synthetic fuels, and heavy weaponry. Industries were reorganized under the logic of permanent mobilization. The economy, science, and youth were subordinated to the war project. Hitler believed that the will of a people could overcome any material limitation and that the planet's resources naturally belonged to strong races. In March 1936, German troops crossed the Rhine and remilitarized the demilitarized zone, another act prohibited by Versailles. It was a reckless gamble. The army was still weak, and a French military response would have destroyed the regime. But no one reacted. Hitler interpreted it as confirmation of his destiny. That night he said to his officers, "Now I know I can do everything." From then on, his confidence in his strategic intuition became dogma. Over the following years, he strengthened his system of alliances and espionage. Italy, under Mussolini, became his natural partner. Both shared the rhetoric of expansionism and disdain for liberal democracies. Japan, in Asia, joined the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, sealing an ideological front against communism. Hitler saw in this alliance proof that history was on his side, that the warrior peoples of the world were uniting against Western decadence. Simultaneously, Goebbels' propaganda apparatus intensified its work. Every announcement of weaponry or diplomatic victory was presented as a triumph of national will. The German people did not see tanks or airplanes, but symbols of pride. Schools instilled obedience and sacrifice. The Hitler youth trained physically for combat. Workers marched to the rhythm of slogans about the destiny of the Reich. The country became a psychological war machine before firing a single shot. Hitler maintained a double mask before the world. On international stages, he spoke of peace, European cooperation, and respect among nations. In private, he dictated orders to accelerate the production of cannons and armored vehicles. His meetings with military leaders were meticulous, almost theatrical. He demanded reports on every caliber, every plane, every logistical plan, convinced that the future war had to be won before it began. In his mind, Germany was a besieged fortress that had to prepare for an inevitable confrontation. By 1938, rearmament was nearly complete. Germany produced more steel than Britain and France combined. The new armored divisions, which would become the future backbone of the Blitzkrieg, were ready. That same year, Hitler moved the next piece, Austria. The annexation, presented as a fraternal union, was in reality a carefully planned invasion. The Anschluss was carried out without firing a bullet. The Western powers, paralyzed by the memory of the Great War, accepted the fait accompli. The Austrian success convinced Hitler that his intuition was infallible. If the world had not dared to defend Vienna, it would not do so with Czechoslovakia either. In September 1938, at the Munich conference, he managed to get the democracies to cede the Sudetenland under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans. What others saw as diplomacy, he interpreted as surrender. His strategy of deception had worked. Germany had rebuilt its army, expanded its borders, and humiliated its enemies, all without an open war. By the end of 1938, Hitler was convinced that history protected him. The Wehrmacht was the instrument of his will, and Europe, a board dominated by fear. Only one step remained, turning rearmament into conquest. The justification for invading Poland. In Hitler's mind, the war against Poland was not an aggression, but a historical necessity. For years, he had spoken of Lebensraum, the living space that Germany needed to conquer in the east to ensure its survival. Poland, created after the Treaty of Versailles, symbolized everything he despised, an artificial nation supported by the Allies and inhabited, according to his rhetoric, by mixed races incapable of self-government. For Hitler, its mere existence was an affront to the destiny of the German people. During the first months of 1939, his tone changed. He no longer spoke of justice or reparation, but of destiny. In private meetings with his generals, he stated that Germany had to act before the democracies could react. He knew his army was ready, that his industry could sustain the war, and that the population followed him blindly. Only the justification remained to be built. In his logic, the aggressor had to present itself as the victim. At the beginning of the year, he ordered Goebbels' propaganda machine to prepare a narrative about the abuses suffered by German minorities in the Polish corridor and the free city of Danzig. The Nazi press began publishing false stories of murdered peasants, raped women, and persecuted German families. Newsreels showed images of coffins covered with German flags, and every official speech ended with the same idea. Germany could not remain indifferent to the suffering of its people. Diplomacy, meanwhile, was a carefully constructed farce. Hitler presented himself to the world as a patient leader, willing to negotiate. He spoke of self-determination and peace, knowing that European democracies feared a new war. But in secret, since April, he had given the order to prepare the invasion. The plan was called Fall Weiss, or Case White, and set the start of operations for September 1939. What Hitler needed was not a moral excuse, but a theatrical act that would appear defensive. The idea of a staged provocation arose within the SS. Reinhard Heydrich, following Himmler's orders, designed a false operation to justify the offensive. On the night of August 31st, a group of agents disguised in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station in the town of Gleiwitz. They left behind several corpses, prisoners from Dachau concentration camp, executed minutes earlier and dressed as enemy soldiers. At dawn, the news spread across Germany. Poland had attacked the Reich. Hitler appeared before the Reichstag on September 1st, 1939. His carefully crafted speech mixed indignation, destiny, and revenge. "From this morning, German troops are responding to Polish attacks," he proclaimed. In reality, more than 1.5 million German soldiers were already advancing on Polish territory. The invasion was swift and devastating. The Wehrmacht deployed an unprecedented combination of armored forces, mobile artillery, and aviation. It was the practical birth of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Hitler watched the maps with satisfaction. Within days, Polish defenses collapsed. Columns of tanks crossed the country while the Luftwaffe destroyed roads, trains, and civilian shelters. In his meetings, the Führer spoke with mystical fervor about the historical justice unfolding before his eyes. He saw the war not as a political action but as a biological act, the expansion of the strong people over the weak. Every conquered city was, for him, a victory of nature. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Hitler had not expected it so soon. For years he had bet that fear would paralyze them, as in Munich. But this time the silence was broken. Nevertheless, he remained unshaken. Before his generals he smiled and said, "Now everything will depend on who resists longer." He believed that the democracies had no will to sacrifice. His confidence in victory was absolute. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Hitler ordered cooperation with the Soviet Union. Weeks earlier, he had signed the non-aggression pact with Stalin, known as Molotov-Ribbentrop. Officially, it was a neutrality agreement, but it contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. On September 17th, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east, completing the partition of the country. For Hitler, it was a masterstroke. He had neutralized his most feared enemy, the Soviet Union, and avoided a two-front war. Images of destroyed Warsaw were celebrated as a triumph in Berlin. Goebbels organized parades, films, and newsreels showing Hitler as the restorer of order. The invasion, presented as a liberation operation, reinforced his aura of infallibility. Deep down, he believed destiny guided him. "Nothing can stop us," he told his ministers. "The next step will be dictated by Providence." In the occupied territories, the SS and Gestapo began their own work. As the army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen executed Polish intellectuals, officers, and priests. Hitler saw these actions as a political requirement to destroy national identity, to erase any possibility of resistance. The war, from his perspective, was not only a military matter, but a racial one. Poland had to disappear as a nation to make way for the future German Empire. By the end of September, the country was divided. Warsaw fell on the 27th, and the last Polish stronghold surrendered on October 6th. In Berlin, Hitler was greeted by euphoric crowds. Flags waved on balconies, children sang anthems, and newspapers spoke of the strategic genius of the Führer. In the Chancellery, officers watched him walk with slow, confident steps, like an actor in his sacred role. He believed he had demonstrated that history responded to his will, that the war was a test of faith, and that the gods of destiny had chosen Germany to rewrite the map of Europe. Admiration for the Blitzkrieg and the early victories. Hitler attended the Blitzkrieg campaigns with a mixture of technical fascination and ideological ecstasy. The Blitzkrieg was not a miraculous invention of the Führer, but it fit perfectly into his worldview: speed, decisiveness, and the annihilation of the adversary before he could articulate his resistance. He observed the coordination between armored units, aviation, and artillery as a choreography meant to impose Germany's will through efficiency. The 1940 Western Campaign was his great cinematic triumph. The strategy that led to the fall of France combined operational boldness with political cunning. After simulating an offensive from the north, the Germans executed the real maneuver through the Ardennes, a region the Allies considered impassable for large armored units. When the armored columns emerged in unexpected terrain, the collapse was as psychological as it was military. Paris fell with a speed that paralyzed Western Europe. In Berlin, the news arrived as sacred acts: painted maps of advance, photos of armies occupying squares, and the growing feeling of a Führer who seemed to touch history with the tips of his fingers. Hitler leveraged these victories not only as military achievements, but as acts of personal legitimization. Each conquest fed the narrative of infallibility that was taking shape in propaganda. In his mind, military genius was not a matter of luck, but of vision. His ability to understand the pulse of the nation, to decide without hesitation, to impose his will over moral and political institutions. The speed of the Blitzkrieg reinforced his conviction that war could be reduced to an act of concentrated and organized will. Norway and Denmark, in April 1940, offered another demonstration of the versatility of the German war machine. The operation combined naval landings, paratroopers, and the prompt neutralization of enemy capabilities to secure access to the North Atlantic and Norwegian iron resources. Hitler valued these successes for their mix of operational audacity and strategic outcome, protecting supply lines, controlling ports, and securing industrial material. Each successful mission confirmed a mental pattern. If speed and surprise were supported by logistics, war became a series of almost inevitable victories. The fall of France, however, had a profound symbolic effect. The humiliation of the Third Republic and the capitulation without prolonged defense in the heart of Europe reinforced in Hitler the idea of Western weakness. He interpreted the absence of fighting will as a historical debt that democracies would pay again and again. The occupation of Paris was shown in the Nazi press as the consummation of a cycle, the restoration of German honor, and the confirmation of the Führer as its architect. The Reich's iconography, composed of flags, banners, and anthems, became inseparable from the narrative of rapid and total victory. From Berlin, the Blitzkrieg seemed to justify everything. At the front, however, the reality was different in nuances that did not alter Hitler's perception. Troops experienced logistical problems, armored columns suffered from maintenance and fuel issues, and the occupation brought the need to administer territories with hostile populations. But these obstacles did not contradict the Führer's central thesis, that lightning war allowed rapid solutions to be imposed, and consequently, enemy resistance could be crushed before structural weaknesses became a threat. In domestic politics, the victories generated a feedback effect. Collective euphoria reinforced obedience and devotion to the leadership. The cult of personality fed on military triumphs presented as proof of a supreme truth. History favored the strong. In the chancellery speeches, every advance translated into moral precepts. The lightning war became a metaphor for the purity and decisiveness that should govern the life of the Reich. Nevertheless, Hitler's admiration for the Blitzkrieg had conceptual limits. He identified it with absolute victory and applied it as a universal doctrine. Speed ceased to be merely a tactic to become a strategic requirement. War had to be swift or not be at all. That premise would later lead him to over-optimistically evaluate operations, whose logistical and geographical variables exceeded the flexibility of the lightning war. While Europe was transforming under the shadow of the Reich, Hitler contemplated the Continental Board with the confidence of one who believes they hold the winning hand. The Blitzkrieg not only toppled states, it also cemented a personal faith that concentrated will, legitimized by technical efficiency and national ardor, made real what until then had been mere thought. From his office, surrounded by maps and reports, he began outlining even more ambitious steps. He believed that if the Western campaign had been a demonstration of unstoppable force, the next act would be the definitive confirmation of his genius. Hitler as Supreme Commander, the illusion of the military genius. The success of the 1940 campaigns cemented in Hitler a dangerous certainty that his intuition was superior to any technical calculation. The generals could know the art of war, but only he understood its spirit. From then on, the Führer began to assume an increasingly direct role in military leadership, intervening in plans, modifying strategies, and subordinating operational logic to the fulfillment of his ideological vision. In the early years of the conflict, he maintained an apparent relationship of respect with the High Command. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated effectiveness and discipline, and its commanders still enjoyed a certain margin of decision. However, as victories accumulated, Hitler displaced professional authority with personal loyalty. He considered military prudence a form of cowardice and believed that the doubts of his officers were not tactical but symptoms of moral weakness. In the Chancellery headquarters and later in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, he began to direct operations with obsessive meticulousness. He demanded daily reports, corrected unit positions on maps, and rewrote entire directives. He did so with the certainty of one who felt chosen by history. War, for him, was a manifestation of will, and if the will was pure, it could not fail. In the General Staff meetings, his tone changed over the months. From exalted enthusiasm to authoritarian monologue, he no longer listened to anyone. Hitler saw military command as a spiritual act, not a technical one. In his words, the generals thought in lines, he thought in destinies. He repeated that the men at the front fought not only for Germany but for a cosmic cause, and that his duty was to keep them moving without hesitation. Losses were inevitable, retreat inconceivable. In his mind, every decision had to reflect the leader's faith in the historical mission of the Reich. That mindset translated into an increasingly rigid command structure. The Army High Command began to lose autonomy before the new Armed Forces High Command, created under his direct control. Hitler saw in this reorganization a way to unify strategy, but in reality, it was a mechanism to concentrate power in his person. The brightest officers, such as Halder, Brauchitsch, and Rundstedt, began to understand that the war was being fought not so much on the front as in the Führer's mind. His day was a routine of obsession. He got up late, worked at night, slept little. He spent hours over maps, moving divisions with colored pencils, convinced he knew every hill and every road better than the men fighting there. He rejected negative reports and punished doubt. When an offensive did not advance, he blamed the lack of faith in victory. For Hitler, war was an act of belief, not calculation. In private, he despised the old Prussian aristocracy that dominated the senior ranks of the army. He considered them incapable of understanding his political vision. While they spoke of strategy, he spoke of racial destiny. That ideological distance turned into distrust. Generals who recommended prudence were sidelined or humiliated. Those who obeyed without question were promoted. Military meritocracy was replaced by ideological devotion. The control he exercised over the commands was also emotional. He alternated grandiloquent praise with outbursts of rage. His style was not that of a rational strategist, but that of a prophet in trance. He believed that his mere presence inspired strength in the troops and that his voice could change the course of battles. Officers learned to adapt reports to his expectations, to soften failures, to invent progress. Thus, a vicious circle formed where military reality disappeared behind the myth. Hitler drew inspiration from the models he admired in German history: Frederick the Great, Bismarck, the conquerors who had shaped nations by the force of decision. But in his case, history became theater. He presented himself as an omniscient commander, a self-taught genius who had broken with the dogmas of the past. Propaganda reinforced this image. Every successful operation was attributed to his personal brilliance, not to the collective work of the general staff. This illusion of infallibility grew with the speed of his victories. In 1940 and 1941, continental Europe seemed to bow before him. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, the Balkans, all had fallen under his control. Hitler saw this as confirmation of his doctrine of absolute command. "History does not reward those who hesitate," he said. For him, the gods were on his side, and war was merely the stage on which he would prove his role as a leader of peoples. However, beneath the surface of success, a fatal error was brewing. By replacing technical judgment with personal faith, Hitler transformed the command structure into an extension of his mind. No criticism survived. Tactical decisions were subordinated to ideological symbols. To resist meant to believe, to retreat, to betray. Thus arose the rigidity that would later cost millions of lives. In the summer of 1941, convinced of his infallibility, Hitler launched the campaign he considered the climax of his destiny, the conquest of the East. What began as a war of expansion would turn into a war of annihilation. The hatred of communism and the fantasy of the German Empire in the East. From the early years of National Socialism, communism meant much more to Hitler than a political doctrine. In his worldview, it was an existential threat. He identified it as a Jewish creation destined to destroy nations from within and to corrupt racial purity. In Mein Kampf, he had already set the equation that would guide all his foreign policy. Judaism equals Bolshevism. That idea, repeated for years, became the ideological justification for total war against the Soviet Union. For Hitler, the conflict with Stalin was not a dispute between systems but a racial crusade. He saw them as inferior races, incapable of creating culture or state, and therefore condemned to serve as labor or to disappear. His model for the future was a German agrarian empire stretching to the Urals, supplying the Reich with food, raw materials, and slaves. By late 1940, while still fighting in Western Europe, Hitler was already thinking about that expansion. Operation Barbarossa began to take shape in his mind as a providential enterprise. In his internal discourse, Germany had to destroy the Soviet Union not only for military security, but to fulfill its historical destiny. In practice, the plan was designed with absolute contempt for logistical warnings. Hitler regarded the magnitude of Soviet territory not as a difficulty, but as an opportunity to demonstrate German superiority. The orders issued before the invasion made his intention clear. This was not a conventional war, but a war of annihilation. Political commissars of the Red Army were to be executed on the spot. Cities, deprived of supplies, were to be left to starve. Prisoners of war were to be treated as subhumans. Hitler demanded limitless brutality, convinced that compassion was weakness. The senior military commanders, though uneasy, complied. In the system he had created, obedience was synonymous with loyalty. On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. It was the largest land invasion in history. Hitler watched the advance from the Wolf's Lair with the excitement of someone who contemplates the culmination of his mission. He was convinced that a few months would be enough to destroy the Colossus with feet of clay. He said it was enough to kick in the door for the whole Bolshevik structure to collapse. At first, the reports seemed to confirm him. Within a few weeks, the German armies took Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners marched westward in endless columns. Hitler saw the images and spoke of them as a divine punishment. Each victory was, for him, proof that nature rewarded strength and punished weakness. Blitzkrieg was now spreading across the Eurasian continent like a religion. But behind the initial victories, the contradiction of his imperial dream began to take shape. The territory was too vast, the distances insurmountable, winter was approaching, and Soviet resistance did not collapse as he had predicted. Yet Hitler would not accept reality. He interpreted every delay as a lack of faith on the part of his generals. "Bolshevism is dead, it just doesn't know it yet," he said. He ordered an unceasing advance toward Moscow, convinced that a single great battle would decide the fate of the world. At the same time, the Nazi occupation apparatus set in motion the other face of the plan: colonization and extermination. In the conquered territories, the Einsatzgruppen received direct orders to eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone associated with the local intelligentsia. The mass murders in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries were presented as security measures. For Hitler, they formed part of the biological engineering of his empire, to cleanse the land of undesirable elements in order to repopulate it with German settlers. The so-called General Plan Ost, drafted by the SS under Himmler's supervision, projected the displacement or elimination of more than 30 million people. Internal documents spoke of evacuation, but the meaning was clear: total Germanization of the East. Villages would be destroyed, children selected for racial traits, crops confiscated to feed the Reich. Hitler imagined an orderly landscape, with model farms and imperial roads inhabited only by pure Germans. It was racial utopia turned into a state plan. In Berlin, propaganda maintained the narrative of inevitable triumph. The Führer appeared surrounded by maps pointing to advances, promising the imminent fall of Moscow. In his speech on October 3, 1941, he declared that the Soviet Union was already broken and would not rise again. But a few kilometers from the Russian capital, the advance stopped. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Tanks would not start. Rifles froze. Divisions lacked shelter. The generals called for retreat and regrouping, but Hitler forbade it. He could not accept that his vision of German destiny be contradicted by the weather or by the resistance of a people he considered inferior. "The German soldier must learn to endure suffering," he shouted at a meeting. His decision condemned tens of thousands of men to die frozen in the steppes. Yet defeat did not alter his conviction. The war in the East was sacred and must continue until the extermination of the enemy. The failure before Moscow marked the beginning of the end of the myth of invincibility. But inside the Führer, it only reinforced his obsession. Convinced that nature itself had given him a mission, Hitler clung even more tightly to his imperial fantasy. In his mind, the East remained the key to the German future, an immense land, purified by violence, where his people would reign for 1,000 years. Reality, however, began to shatter that illusion. The Soviet Union was not defeated, its factories produced more weapons, its armies regrouped, and winter made no racial distinctions. The Holocaust as a central part of the war project. For Hitler, the Jewish question was not a social problem to be solved within the Reich. It was a strategic piece on his war board. From his earliest political vocabulary, anti-Semitism occupied a central place. With the war, that hostility transformed into state policy and a tool to maximize the resources of the conflict. The systematic elimination of the Jews was thus articulated not only as an ideological goal, but as a means to ensure military efficiency, economic exploitation, and the demographic reordering of the continent. In Hitler's vision, the Jewish presence was inseparable from the decadence he attributed to the West and the Bolshevik threat he attributed to the East. Exterminating the Jews meant, in his logic, purging the nation of a supposed tumor and at the same time stripping an internal enemy of its economic and cultural networks. Practically, the cleansing of entire communities freed assets that could be expropriated to finance the war and sustain the state apparatus. For a leadership that saw society as a manipulable resource, repression also had a utilitarian calculation. The apparatus that transformed hatred into action was a complex machinery in which Hitler delegated functions and legitimacy. Himmler and the SS were responsible for turning ideological intent into administrative and operational processes. The mobile extermination units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the advance of the Wehrmacht in 1941, carrying out mass massacres in the Soviet rear. The killings at Babi Yar in Kiev or on the vast Ukrainian plains were, from the leadership's perspective, security measures meant to eliminate potential resistance centers and annihilate those considered enemies by ethnicity or political affiliation. The logistics of the crime evolved with the war. What began as mass executions in open pits was rationalized and technified: camps, ghettos, deportations, and finally industrial death centers. The establishment of concentration and extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec corresponded to methodical planning where bureaucracy combined with the genocidal drive. Documents, orders, transport lists, and accounting registrations show how administrative efficiency served the criminal objective. For Hitler and his collaborators, the ability to organize annihilation was a demonstration of total control over society and over the war. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 symbolized the conversion of anti-Semitism into state policy on a European scale. There, high-ranking Reich officials coordinated mechanisms for the deportation and treatment of Jewish populations in territories under German control. From the Führer's perspective, these decisions were not moral errors but logical steps in the consolidation of a racial empire that required the suppression of what was considered impure. The technical rationality employed in Wannsee and in the ministries revealed the coldness with which annihilation was treated. Death was calculated, measured, and organized with the same meticulousness with which offensives and supplies were planned. Hitler also perceived an instrumental dimension in the use of prisoner labor. The camps were not only places of extermination, they also became sources of slave labor for the armaments industry and the occupational economy. German companies and military administrations extracted benefits from forced labor. Economic exploitation was thus aligned with the war objective, maintaining production and supply under conditions of scarcity. From the Führer's desk, the logic was clear. If the war demanded resources, repression could provide them. The relationship between war and genocide was also expressed in the marginalization of international norms. Under the pretext of security, conventions were suspended, civilian protection was annulled, and the law was redefined as an instrument of exception. Hitler saw in this the opportunity to formalize practices that, in peacetime, would have been unthinkable. The exception of war justified, in the regime's language, extraordinary measures systematically applied against Jews and other persecuted groups. Even when the military leadership could warn of the strategic and logistical risks of devoting resources to mass repression, Hitler maintained that the destruction of undesirable elements was inseparable from military success. In his calculation, allowing the existence of communities considered subversive was a risk more dangerous than any wear and tear of war material. Furthermore, the policy of internal terror served to terrify entire populations and reduce the possibility of sabotage or resistance in occupied territories. Repression thus became an instrument of pacification and territorial control. The human cost of these decisions was immeasurable, and for the Nazi state machine it was also a variable integrated into planning. Deportations by train, systematic selection upon arrival, and a continuous flow of men, women, and children who underwent an industrial process of annihilation. Hitler not only tolerated this machinery, he legitimized it in historical and biological terms, presenting it as a necessary act for the survival of the German people. In his narrative, elimination was a historical task, comparable in its gravity to the great political enterprises that, according to him, forged nations. With the war spreading and the front lines changing, genocidal policy remained a priority. It was neither a marginal policy nor an accident. It was a central piece of the regime's political and military project. The fatal mistake, underestimating the Soviet Union and the Russian winter. The campaign against the Soviet Union was marked by a double miscalculation that, in Hitler's mind, could not exist. Underestimating the adversary's capacity for resistance and undervaluing the power of nature. Both elements, which for any prudent military leader would have been essential variables, were for him dispensable obstacles in the march of a destiny he believed inexorable. That mix of arrogance and denial eventually became the open wound that would ultimately bleed the Reich dry. In the summer of 1941, the magnitude of the invasion exceeded any precedent. More than 3 million men, thousands of tanks and hundreds of planes poured eastward at a devastating pace. The first successes seemed to confirm the logic of Blitzkrieg: deep breakthroughs, encirclement of large forces, and collapse of the enemy's state apparatus. But at the same time that the divisions advanced, supply lines extended in a geometry that German logistics had not experienced at such a scale. Dirt roads turned into bands of mud, railway routes with different gauges, warehouses hundreds of kilometers away from the mobile columns. All this undermined the promise of continuous advance. Hitler did not accept that the war in the East required another way of waging war. For him, the flexibility demonstrated in Western Europe had to be replicated identically in Russia. He required the units to advance without stopping, for the offensive to be relentless until the final breakthrough. When the High Command suggested pauses to reorganize, secure communications and regroup supplies, the Führer interpreted the proposal as a lack of will. "The enemy will break if we move forward," he insisted, convinced that any respite was a moral and strategic concession. The operational decision that symbolized this mixture of faith and error was the dispersion of objectives. Instead of concentrating all forces on a decisive objective such as Moscow, Hitler endorsed the diversion of large units to the south and north, the capture of Ukraine with its agricultural and industrial resources, and the siege of Leningrad with its symbolic and historical value. For him, possessing these territories was both a material matter and an assertion of racial dominance. The generals, who asked to prioritize and concentrate, saw the campaign diluted across fronts, each with its own drain of resources. Intelligence also failed to feed the illusion. Optimistic reports on the internal decomposition of the Soviet Union, erroneous calculations about industrial mobilization capacity, and underestimation of the spirit of resistance fueled the false conviction of a swift victory. Hitler, already living in a sphere of certainties, embraced these readings as confirmation. In his speeches and meetings, he rejected the possibility of a long war. He considered it a tactical heresy. This structural rejection of uncertainty led him to plan with supposed precision something that, by definition, was unpredictable. When winter arrived, reality harshly contradicted that confidence. The Russian cold was not a metaphor. It was a mechanism that disrupted logistics and men. Extreme temperatures froze carburetors, petrified lubricants, and reduced machine mobility. Roads became traps. Trucks were stranded, and the lack of clothing and rations turned the troops into victims of the climate as much as of combat. Logistical problems such as the lack of adequate winter clothing, insufficient spare parts, or broken supply chains revealed that the advance had been possible only due to momentary audacity, not the sustainability of the effort. Hitler, far from admitting that nature had erected a barrier, interpreted the stalemate as proof of cowardice or treason. Requests for withdrawal or reorganization were considered by him as acts of moral surrender. Instead of delegating to his military chiefs with full technical powers, he hardened orders and prohibitions. Do not retreat, hold positions at any cost, punish severely any local initiative that contradicted the higher line. The war ceased to be an adaptive process and became a dogmatic commandment. This religious conversion of strategy had concrete consequences. Units were immobilized in positions that supply could not sustain. The loss of men due to weather and combat accelerated. Morale deteriorated under conditions that propaganda could not conceal. The human tide that believed itself capable of civilizing the East began to suffer the erosion of fatigue and starvation. Frontline reports, which had previously been adjusted so as not to upset the Führer, began to accumulate figures impossible to disguise. increasing losses, insufficient replacement lines, and a Soviet industrial capacity relocating factories beyond the Urals and increasing its production. Underestimating the enemy also manifested in the inability to foresee popular resistance and partisan warfare. Where Hitler expected the surrender of inferior populations, the occupation was met with sabotage, guerrillas, and a war of attrition that multiplied the need for occupation troops. Every act of repression against civilians, conceived as an instrument of racial pacification, fueled resistance and diverted military resources to internal repression. The line between operations against armies and security operations blurred, and the war effort fragmented into 1,000 contradictory tasks. In the Chancellery, the response was the reiteration of will. Hitler further locked himself into his cycle of imperative decisions. The notion of a strategic withdrawal became politically unacceptable. The error was no longer only tactical. It had become a political principle and a test of character. Surrendering to evidence would have been admitting that his historical vision was fallible, and that in his mental scheme amounted to treason. The combination of unmanageable distances, reorganized resistance, extreme weather conditions, and political decisions that denied logistical logic created altogether a web of problems. Every attempt at a partial solution met an adverse response. Reorganizing delayed operations, reinforcing fronts weakened other areas, insisting on offensives prolonged losses. What had at first seemed a demonstration of power turned into a trap of attrition. The entry of the United States into the war. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed the world balance. For Hitler, the news came as an unexpected blow, but he interpreted it through the same ideological lens as everything else, not as a warning, but as a confirmation of his worldview. For months, intelligence services had informed him of growing tensions between Japan and the United States. However, not even the most optimistic strategists of the High Command believed that Tokyo would directly attack such an industrialized power. When the radio announced the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hitler reacted with a mixture of euphoria and relief. In his view, Japan's entry meant the opening of a second front that would distract the Western enemies of the Reich. It was, according to him, the alliance of the warrior peoples against the empires of money and decadence. On December 11th, without having been attacked by Washington, Germany declared war on the United States. The decision was not consulted with the military command nor with his diplomatic advisors. It was an act of ideological impulse. Hitler considered it inevitable. If the world was divided between two irreconcilable orders, total confrontation had to occur. In his speech before the Reichstag, he spoke of Roosevelt as the spokesperson of international Judaism and presented the war as a crusade against capitalism and communism, now united in the same bloc. The American entry altered the proportions of the war in a way that even he could not measure. Until that moment, Germany had faced European powers with limited or disorganized resources. Now it had to fight against an industrial continent with almost infinite production capacity. In 1942, American factories began producing more planes, tanks, and ships than all of Europe combined. But Hitler, trapped in his own faith in will over matter, dismissed the figures. In the nightly meetings at the headquarters, he repeated that the true enemy was not on the fronts, but in the corrupt minds that controlled the press and the economy. The war, he said, had to become a global confrontation between civilizations. That ideological interpretation prevented him from seeing the logistical dimension of the conflict he himself had provoked. While the United States multiplied its production, Germany remained tied to the resources it managed to extract from occupied territories and to an industrial system that was already showing signs of fatigue. His reaction was to intensify internal political control. Partial defeats on the Eastern Front, the failure in Moscow, and the beginning of Allied bombings over Germany pushed him toward rhetoric of total resistance. In his speeches of 1942 and 1943, Hitler spoke of the final world war between the peoples of spirit and those of money. He demanded absolute sacrifice from the German people. The enemy was no longer an army, it was the entire world. Goebbels' propaganda adapted the narrative. Factories worked tirelessly while the population endured rationing and the first bombings. Newsreels showed images of ruins with heroic music in the background, exalting resistance. Hitler appeared in public less frequently, but when he did, his figure still projected authority. The masses still saw him as the man who had returned national pride, not as the leader who had pushed Germany toward an ever deeper abyss. Internally, the Führer remained convinced that the course of the war could be reversed with a decisive maneuver. Despite the warnings of his generals, he refused to withdraw troops from the Eastern Front. He preferred to lose entire divisions rather than admit that the dream of dominating Eurasia had ended. In his private conversations, the entry of the United States was described as an accident, a provocation by international Zionism. In reality, it had made him the unwitting architect of a war impossible to win. Meanwhile, the Allies were consolidating an unprecedented coalition. Cooperation between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union unified resources, intelligence, and strategy. The massive production of war material in America and the supply to the Soviet Union through routes such as the Arctic turned material superiority into an avalanche. Hitler knew this but rejected any quantitative comparison. Machines do not defeat men, he insisted. His faith in the collective German will remained his ultimate argument. From 1943 onwards, the difference between faith and illusion became irreconcilable. The Eastern Front was slowly collapsing, North Africa was being lost, and Italy was beginning to waver as an ally. Yet Hitler refused to admit that the war had transformed into a struggle of desperate resistance. In his words, "Germany cannot lose, only Germans can fail." That phrase, delivered coldly, defined his new strategy. Intensify internal discipline, eliminate all doubt, and prolong the war beyond any logical reasoning. On February 18, 1943, Goebbels delivered the famous Total War speech in Berlin, reflecting the Führer's thinking. It was the tacit admission that the imperial dream had failed, but also an attempt to transform disaster into an epic of sacrifice. Direct clashes with key generals. The war had transformed Hitler into a commander who no longer tolerated nuances. His absolute authority within the Reich had accustomed him to an environment where any discrepancy was interpreted as treason. On the military front, that psychology pitted him against the same men who, in the early years, had executed his orders brilliantly. Tensions with the generals became a theater of suspicion, dismissals, and public humiliations. The war ceased to be a collective enterprise and became an extension of the Führer's temperament. One of the first to experience that confrontation was Gerd von Rundstedt, a veteran of the Prussian army, who had participated in almost all the major German campaigns. Respected for his experience, he represented the professional tradition that Hitler despised. On the Western Front, during 1941 and 1942, Rundstedt dared to express what many silently thought, that total war was unsustainable, that the lines were too extended, and that the enemy had material superiority. Hitler interpreted these observations as defeatism. He dismissed him for lack of faith in victory and temporarily replaced him, though later rehired him, aware of his capability. From then on, every encounter between them was a silent struggle between military reality and political obstinacy. Heinz Guderian, the intellectual creator of the Blitzkrieg, was another target of this tension. Guderian had shown that mobility and surprise could decide a war, but his frankness made him intolerable to Hitler. When the Russian winter halted the 1941 offensive, Guderian insisted on withdrawing to save units and reorganize logistics. Hitler accused him of cowardice. In December, he removed him from command and placed him in reserve. Guderian, who had symbolized the German army's technical innovation, became a pariah within the structure he had helped create. He was only rehabilitated in 1943, when the disaster in the East forced Hitler to turn again to his former critics, albeit under strict supervision. The most emblematic case was that of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. In Africa, Rommel had become a hero both for the German people and the regime's propaganda. His audacity and tactical sense made him legendary, but his independence aroused the Führer's mistrust. Hitler admired his victories but was irritated by his tendency to act without waiting for orders. When the situation in North Africa began to deteriorate, Rommel warned of the impossibility of resisting without reinforcements or fuel. He proposed withdrawing to defensive positions. Hitler, faithful to his dogma of not yielding ground, accused him of defeatism and ordered resistance to the end. Privately, he called Rommel a tourist general, incapable of understanding the ideological dimension of the war. The fall of the Afrika Korps and the loss of North Africa in 1943 sealed the fate of their relationship. Although Rommel continued serving in Europe, the Führer no longer trusted him. When in 1944 he was indirectly implicated in the July 20th plot, his fate was sealed. Hitler offered him a choice, a public trial that would drag his family down, or a silent suicide. Rommel chose the second option. For the Führer, his death was another necessary purge. For history, it was the symbol of the definitive rupture between the military ideal and the political madness of the regime. Disputes were not limited to the external fronts. Within the High Command's internal structure, Hitler maintained an atmosphere of competition and surveillance that nullified any effective coordination. Rivalry among the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the SS was deliberately encouraged. Göring, Himmler, and Keitel spied on each other to gain the Führer's confidence. Reports arrived distorted, figures were doctored, failures disguised as partial victories. In this tangle of misinformation, Hitler made decisions increasingly disconnected from reality, but no one dared contradict him. His distrust was total. He saw conspiracies in every delay, in every suggestion of withdrawal. In meetings, his tone shifted from cold calm to outbursts of rage in a matter of minutes. He threw objects, slammed the table, shouted at officers until they were silenced. Tactical discussions turned into ideological interrogations. He asked not what they thought, but what they believed. The war became a test of personal faith. "The Führer commands, history obeys," he repeated, convinced that maps would bend to his will. In 1944, tensions reached an irreversible point. The Allied landing in Normandy revealed the fragility of the command system. Generals asked for freedom of maneuver to respond quickly. Hitler insisted on directing every move from his bunker, refusing to accept that the front changed by the minute. Rundstedt, again in command of the West, begged for permission to withdraw and reorganize the defense. Hitler forbade it. "There can be no retreat on German soil," he decreed. Days later, he dismissed him again. The chain of contradictory orders turned the defense into chaos. As the Allies advanced, the Führer remained convinced that a miraculous counterattack would reverse the situation. The generals who had been his instruments became his victims. Many were demoted, arrested, or forced to commit suicide. Those who stayed by his side did so more out of fear than conviction. Hitler had achieved what he had always wanted, an army completely subordinated to his will. Suicidal orders and the denial of reality. In the final years of the war, Hitler's leadership ceased to be an exercise in strategy and became a succession of impossible commands. His connection to reality fractured under the weight of defeat, yet his authority, fueled by fear and fanaticism, remained intact. Orders became expressions of will without material basis or tactical sense. Resist, die, sacrifice. These words replaced any military logic. The Führer had transformed the war into a liturgy where every loss had to be justified as proof of purity. The turning point was Stalingrad. The city, turned into a symbol, absorbed the last remnants of rationality in German strategy. Since the summer of 1942, Hitler had insisted on capturing it not for its industrial value, but for its name. Victory had to be a direct humiliation for Stalin. When the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was encircled by Soviet forces in the winter of 1942, the commanders requested permission to break the siege and retreat. Hitler forbade it. "Stalingrad will be taken or lost to the last man," he ordered. For weeks, German soldiers resisted amid ruins and sub-zero temperatures, surrounded by a growing enemy. The Luftwaffe promised air supply, but reality proved otherwise. Planes could barely cover a fraction of daily needs. Still, Hitler demanded holding the position. His logic was symbolic. If Stalingrad fell, the myth of German infallibility would collapse with it. When General Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943, with nearly 100,000 starving survivors, Hitler considered him a traitor. He should have committed suicide like a true German, he said, unable to accept that his order had led to the annihilation of an entire army. From that moment, retreat vanished from his vocabulary. Every front had to be held at any cost. Officers who tried to reason were dismissed or sent to the front without command. From 1943 onwards, the German military structure operated under a single slogan: resist even if there were no weapons, fuel, or men left. Destroyed divisions were reconstructed on paper, and orders came from the bunker with mathematical precision and complete detachment. Hitler directed battles with maps and pins, believing the front responded to geometry. The gap between his decisions and battlefield reality grew into an abyss. The same phenomenon repeated at Kursk in the summer of 1943. Hitler insisted on launching a massive offensive to regain the initiative in the east, convinced that a decisive strike could turn the tide. Generals warned that the element of surprise was lost, that the Soviets were prepared, and that the enemy's material superiority was already overwhelming. He ignored all reports. Operation Citadel ended in catastrophe. Thousands of tanks destroyed, irrecoverable losses, and the definitive end of the German offensive on the Eastern Front. But for Hitler, the causes were not logistical or strategic, but spiritual. "We lacked faith," he murmured to his officers, pointing at the map with a trembling hand. As the Reich retreated, the scale of the suicidal orders increased. In 1944, after the Allied landing in Normandy and the collapse of the Western Front, Hitler forbade any withdrawal on German soil. Every city was to become a fortress, every soldier a wall. Berlin, Danzig, Breslau, Königsberg, all were declared places of total resistance. The slogan was a sentence: whoever surrendered would be executed, whoever survived had to resist. Meanwhile, civilians were conscripted into improvised militias, children of the Hitler Youth were handed rifles and slogans of glory, and the SS summarily executed those who tried to flee. The decomposition of the state was disguised as discipline. Hitler saw in the suffering of the people a form of national redemption. Losses were inevitable, defeat impossible. In the Führer's rhetoric, every destroyed city was an offering to German greatness. Goebbels' propaganda spoke of heroic sacrifice, while Allied bombs razed Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. In military reports, casualty figures were omitted or transformed into abstract numbers impossible to argue with. Truth was a luxury the regime could no longer afford. The Führer's isolation reached its peak in 1945. Locked in the Chancellery bunker, surrounded by secretaries, aides, and a circle of loyal officers, Hitler kept dictating orders to non-existent armies. He demanded impossible movements, insisted on phantom divisions, pressed for counterattacks from fronts that no longer existed. His aides marked lines on maps, knowing those units had been destroyed weeks earlier. But no one dared correct him. Meetings had become rituals of obedience. Everyone nodded, everyone pretended the war continued. As the Soviet noose closed around Berlin, his orders took on the tone of a purge. He had officers accused of weakness shot, ordered the destruction of essential infrastructure to prevent the enemy from using it, and arranged the burning of archives and works of art. His final logic was simple and devastating. If Germany had failed in its historic mission, it must disappear with him. "The German people have betrayed me," he said at his last military conference. "They do not deserve to survive." The total break, the July 20th, 1944 conspiracy. The assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944 was more than a mere attempt on Hitler's life. It represented the internal collapse of the blind loyalty that had sustained the regime. For years, Hitler's figure had been untouchable within the German hierarchy. The personal oath of loyalty, established since 1934, turned any opposition into a sacred crime. But as the war turned into a catastrophe, a group of officers, diplomats, and members of the General Staff began to conceive the unthinkable, eliminating the Führer to save what remained of Germany. General Klaus von Stauffenberg, mutilated in Africa and witness to the Reich's collapse, embodied the contradiction of a military elite that had served the regime with discipline, but now saw it as a destroyer of the nation. Alongside him joined officers such as Henning von Tresckow, Ludwig Beck, and Erwin von Witzleben, among others. The plan was simple in concept and almost impossible in execution: to assassinate Hitler, take control of Berlin through Operation Valkyrie, an emergency plan originally conceived to suppress internal uprisings and negotiate peace with the Allies before the complete occupation of the country. On July 20th, Stauffenberg attended a meeting at the Rastenburg headquarters with a bomb hidden in his briefcase. He placed the device under the table where Hitler was reviewing maps with his officers. At 12:42, the explosion destroyed the room, killed 4 people, and injured several attendees. But Hitler survived. The oak table absorbed much of the impact and saved his life. That detail changed the course of history. The following hours were a combination of confusion and fate. In Berlin, the conspirators briefly believed that the Führer had died. They activated Operation Valkyrie, mobilized troops, arrested SS members, and began issuing orders on behalf of a new provisional government. But Hitler's voice, broadcast by radio from Rastenburg that same night, destroyed all hope. "I am alive, and the revenge will be terrible," he said. The coup collapsed within hours. Hitler interpreted the assassination attempt not as an act of patriotic desperation, but as confirmation of his worldview, a network of internal traitors willing to destroy him from within. Suspicion, which had been a tool of control for years, became total obsession. He ordered an immediate purge. Thousands of people were arrested within days. The Volksgerichtshof courts, led by Roland Freisler, transformed the trials into public spectacles of humiliation. The accused were insulted, beaten, and hanged with piano wires, their bodies displayed as a warning. The circle of power narrowed even further. Hitler no longer trusted anyone outside his immediate circle. He saw enemies even among the most devoted. The few generals who tried to reason with him were sidelined or forced into retirement. The chain of command, already weakened, became a labyrinth of terror. No officer knew if their superior would survive the following week. The policy of fear paralyzed decision-making and destroyed the last vestiges of military cooperation. Psychologically, the assassination attempt marked Hitler's definitive transition into paranoid isolation. His health visibly deteriorated, uncontrollable tremors, insomnia, prolonged episodes of rage. He would spend days without sleeping, locked in his bunker, reviewing maps with a hand that could no longer hold a pencil firmly. He spoke of Providence as a personal shield. "Only the force of destiny protects me," he repeated, convinced that his survival was proof of divine choice. The subsequent repression eliminated not only the conspirators but anyone who had expressed doubts in the past. Officers, officials, priests, and members of the aristocracy were executed without evidence. In the following months, more than 5,000 people were killed in the purge. The Germany that Hitler had promised to unify under an ideal now sank into a wave of violence directed against itself. The political effect was devastating. The army lost many of its most capable leaders, and fear replaced initiative. On the fronts, troops fought without hope, while in Berlin, internal betrayal was cited as the explanation for all defeats. In his delirium, Hitler saw sabotage in every failure. "If everyone had followed me with faith, victory would have been ours," he said in a meeting with his ministers, pounding the table with his fist. From that moment on, the Führer ruled a country in ruins, sustained only by fanatics and bureaucrats who feared his wrath more than defeat. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save Germany ended up consolidating the dictatorship in its purest form, that of a solitary man who no longer listened, surrounded by empty obedience. The end in the bunker, from the Messiah of the Reich to the sunken leader. The Führer, once omnipresent, had become a shadow locked underground, directing an empire that only existed on the maps of his desk. His world shrank to a maze of concrete and steel, the Führer bunker in the gardens of the Chancellery in Berlin. There, surrounded by secretaries, officers, doctors, and personal aides, Hitler spent his last 120 days of existence. The bunker had damp air, narrow corridors, and a lighting that never went out. His routine was an echo of the past. He reviewed reports that no longer reflected anything real, dictated orders to non-existent armies, and reprimanded generals who had long since lost control of their units. Each day his circle grew smaller. Eva Braun, his companion for years, remained at his side. Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, was the last unwavering believer. Outside Germany had ceased to exist. Berlin was a field of ruins. Children from the Hitler Youth patrolled the streets with rocket launchers, civilians died under the bombings, and the shelters were saturated. Hitler, however, refused to abandon the capital. He said that his destiny had to be fulfilled there where his greatness had begun. His belief in Providence became the final dogma. If the German people had failed, they must be destroyed along with him. Hitler's physical deterioration was evident. He suffered constant tremors, could barely walk, and his speeches had become erratic monologues. He spoke of impossible counterattacks, of divisions that no longer existed, of secret weapons that would change the course of the war. His aides pretended to take notes. Meetings with the General Staff turned into empty ceremonies in which unreal war reports were read and plans were drawn on maps that represented territories already occupied. Sometimes he spent minutes in silence, looking at the floor before exploding in fury. In April 1945, when Soviet troops crossed the Oder and approached Berlin, Hitler still ordered a total defense. Divisions formed by adolescents, the elderly and remnants of destroyed units received the order to fight to the end. Goebbels organized radio speeches in which he promised the resurrection of the Reich and compared the situation to the fall of Rome. For the faithful, dying for Hitler was a form of redemption. For the others, only silence remained. On April 16th, the final Soviet offensive on Berlin began. In less than 2 weeks, the encirclement was complete. Hitler continued issuing orders to phantom armies, believing that General Wenck's 12th Army would arrive to rescue the city. None of those forces existed anymore as operational structures. Even so, he ordered imaginary counterattacks, convinced that destiny would intervene once more in his favor. The following days were a descent into delirium. Hitler dictated his political testament on April 29, 1945, written by his secretary Traudl Juncker. In it, he blamed the Jews for the war and declared his faith in the historical mission of National Socialism. He designated Karl Dönitz as successor, Goebbels as Chancellor of the Reich, and left instructions so that his body would not fall into enemy hands. That night he married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. There was champagne and silence. At dawn, Berlin was burning. On April 30th, while the Soviets were forcing their way through the neighboring streets, Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He secluded himself in his room with Eva Braun. He ordered not to be interrupted. Shortly after, a shot was heard. When the attendants opened the door, they found him slumped on the sofa, a shot to the temple, a broken cyanide capsule in his mouth. Eva Braun lay beside him, also poisoned. The bodies were wrapped in blankets, doused with gasoline, and burned in the Chancellery garden following his instructions. The news spread through the corridors of the bunker like a contained rumor. Goebbels, faithful to the end, committed suicide the next day along with his wife after murdering their 6 children. The remnants of the regime dissolved among flames and smoke. In the following days, the Soviet army took the Chancellery, and the Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, disappeared after 12 years.